Hello everyone and welcome to today's OVTO webinar. My name is Jobin John and I'm a researcher at Chalmers University of Technology in Sweden. I'll be your host for this webinar. Today we have Felix Rissi from TU Graz, who will be talking about the use of HPMs in Euro NCAP CP550. If this is your first time joining of the webinar and you're wondering what OVTO is, OVTO stands for Open Virtual Testing Organization. OVTO was established as a non-profit spin-off from a European project called Virtual, where we developed open access tools for virtual testing, some of which you may have seen, like the open source HPM Viva Plus. The OpenVT platform, which was set up in the virtual project as a GitLab server for virtual testing related tools and resources, currently hosts a number of open source resources for virtual testing, including the Euro NCAP HPM for VT load cases. About our speaker for today, Felix Rissi is a senior scientist at the Vehicle Safety Institute at Graz University of Technology, where he leads the occupant safety team within Corinna Kluck's Crash and Injury Prevention Research Group. He worked with major HPM developers and other stakeholders to create the HPM qualification procedure for Euro NCAP, including publicly available HPM agnostic simulation setups, open source assessment notebooks, and a scoring methodology. Felix is a member of the Open Virtual Testing Organization. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and will be made available on YouTube later for those who could not attend live or would like to relive the content. We will begin with Felix's talk, and this will be followed by a Q&A session where questions can be submitted through the WebEx chat. Over to you, Felix.
All right. Thank you, Jobin, and hi, everyone. Thanks for the nice introduction, and thanks for everyone for joining. Great to see there's a lot of interest in this topic, many familiar names as far as I've scrolled through the participants, and also great to see there's a lot of new ones. As Jobin has said, my name is Felix Rissi, and today I'm going to tell you about human body models in Euro NCAP's Frontal Impact Protocol specifically, which involves diving also into two technical bulletins on crash protection, the number 550 and 551. But first, and as Jobin said, this will be available on YouTube later, almost indefinitely maybe, so some caveats to keep in mind. I have made some simplifications just to make it easier to follow, so if there is something which is not exactly accurate in the sense of, well, there's one step you missed, Felix, some simplifications are, I think, a good idea to make it easier to follow. And also, while I'm doing my best, I cannot really provide legally binding information here, so keep that in mind. And most importantly, all the information in this webinar is valid as of today, at least. And the next Euro NCAP protocol update will be implemented in 2029, and aspects in technical bulletins may even change before that. So keep that in mind and always make sure you rely on the latest relevant documents. We will put those into the video description as well, so you can review that later and you don't have to frantically copy links from this presentation while we're at it. With that being said, I'd like to start and say, well, why are we doing all of this? So what's the motivation behind using HPMs in virtual testing? Well, first, virtual methods in general are increasingly important, not only in development, but also in vehicle safety assessment. And Euro NCAP has been a pioneer to some extent in this. And one of the main goals here is to foster robustness. And human body models in particular enable to overcome many limitations of current dummies or ATDs. And one of them is that they enable enhanced injury assessment, for instance, rib fracture, risk predictions, and that down to a tissue level. And this can also be used then to consider effects like aging. And very importantly, we can consider anthropometries where no ATDs, no hardware exists. And this is really a key benefit offered by human body models. And also, these models enable that we look into lower severity but higher exposure crashes, which recently research has shown that they are really relevant in the overall accidentology. So we say that's a really important step, including HPMs, but as always, there's major challenges involved with new developments. And I have brought 4 major challenges for HPM implementation, and this is also providing some structure to this webinar. And the first one, of course, is we need to make sure that the models are good enough. So this is what we call the qualification of human body models for virtual testing. And the issue here is that we have no direct, well-defined physical counterpart. Like when you think of a dummy, you have the physical measurement device. That doesn't exist, of course, for human body models. While actual humans exist, every human is a bit different. And that just leads to the fact that if you do PMHS testing, if you do post-mortem human subject testing, you have inherent biological variability there. So there's always going to be differences. And that's just the nature of the tool. A second part is that we really need to make sure that we have harmonized usage of these models in virtual testing. So the question, how can we use these models in a comparable way? And further, also harmonized interpretation of results is a key challenge. So for instance, to know which outputs to use, how to use them in particular. And finally, we need to make sure that the simulation results, we have integrity of these results. So we need to ensure that they were generated with qualified models, that the results were not tampered with, and we can trust these results. As I set out at the beginning, and the title suggests, there are several documents where Euro NCAP sort of references HPMs, and in particular for the scope here, this is the Frontal Impact Protocol, the Technical Bulletin Crash Protection 550, and Technical Bulletin CP551. And briefly, what do these deal with? So the protocol essentially just answers the question, what is part of the frontal crash protection assessment? So it details the MPDB test, how to do full width deformable barrier testing, and then SLED and virtual testing. So if we zoom into just the SLED and virtual testing part, here we have a load case matrix, which shows all the cases that are detailed in this protocol. And you can see that 2 of them are to be done in hardware as well as simulation for validating the SLED setup, etc. And then you have 4 more which you do virtually. And of those, we have 1 case where there's a driver HPM in the SLED environment. So onwards to the Technical Bulletin CP550. This answers the question, when can you use an HPM for virtual testing? What does it need to do? So this describes the qualification procedure and all the qualification requirements from geometry to quality, detailing the outputs, and also the scores which you need to achieve if you run the validation load cases. And I will touch on that more over the course of this webinar. And the third document essentially answers, what do the HPM simulations need to look like? And what data do we need to provide to Euro NCAP? How to set up the load case in terms of seat position, HPM position, etc. And then what quality criteria do we need to fulfill to make these eligible for Euro NCAP? So these are the documents essentially. And now I want to jump to the process just to highlight how this ties in with existing virtual testing. So of course, virtual testing as such is not new for Euro NCAP. This has been around for dummies, specifically for the world seat dummy. And this, for instance, is another technical bulletin, just CP520, dealing with the world seat qualification. Another document is available for the hybrid free simulations. So this is also something which is already in place now. And just to recap how this works, you have a qualified dummy model. This is checked, of course, by Euro NCAP. You do your CAE simulations, a set of virtual testing simulations, some of them are validation simulations. And then for the virtual testing stuff, you have checks on data quality, consistency, and completeness, and several quality criteria. If you also pass this, you can then move on to do your laboratory testing. And here, your validation simulations will be checked against the validation SLED results from the physical tests. And that's your validation check in terms of ISO score, as well as assessment criteria. And all of this is then combined in the assessment and scoring part, and you get points for virtual testing as well as your SLED results. So if we add human body models on top of that, the key part here is that we need to also make sure that we have a qualification part for the human body models. And as I just mentioned, this is CP550 in essence. Note that while for 2026 to 2029, we have this monitoring phase. So this means the injury risk of the human body model simulations is not assessed. But so these results still have to be submitted to be eligible for all the virtual testing scores. If you don't submit them, your maximum available score from virtual testing will be halved. So let's try to tackle the major challenges. So I started with the qualification part. So how is this now set up for Euro NCAP? Well, and some people will maybe remember some of these slides from an Akobe presentation, and this is because the Akobe paper we made deals exactly with this procedure. So, but bear with me, there's some new slides as always. So these HBM neutral simulation setups, they are based on 19 publications, and they are, as we have heard in the introduction, they are HBM agnostic. So the user just needs to bring their human body model, and then there's a step-by-step guide to set up the simulations. This was maybe what I had in mind when I originally started this work, and it's really, you just put your model in, you get a HBM neutral simulation setup combined with that, and then you have a ready-to-run LS-DYNA deck. It's almost like that, not quite, but we're close. And some important facts about these simulations. So the HBM positioning, for instance, is mostly done within the simulation. Only the initial orientation is modified by parameters the user has to set initially, but the rest of the positioning is part of the simulation. And the reason behind that is that the goal was to have a high degree of reproducibility, as well as allow for future integration of hashing, so traceability, which I will touch on later. So we want to make sure the HBM remains unchanged in this step, and no user interference, so to say, happens, which is not controlled. So what do these look like? Here is a slide showing examples of the impactor tests. So these are animations where you can also see that in some cases you have some initial positioning first, moving the arms out of the way, for instance, in these cases, or the lower legs in this case, and then the actual loading phase takes place. There are also tabletop tests in this validation catalog among these setups based on 19 publications. There's some examples shown here, or there are the examples in the catalog shown here. And finally, there are SLED cases, and these are the 5 animations showing what these look like, what the setups look like. If you're interested, of course, you can look at these animations later on YouTube, but also these are all available as an example, these animations specifically, in the HBM4VT validation catalog, and the link will be shared here and be in the description below. But what do we do with these simulations? So we extract relevant information on kinematics, for instance, and then have derived corridors from the PMHS data and compare these with our HBM response. And for this, we have developed a specific scoring methodology. And before I touch on how the scoring works, I need to do some explaining of some basics, how this works. So the basis for our methodology is a library or a method called ArcGen. And actually, this was developed by Devon Hartland and Dwayne Cronin. The pictures I show here are from their publication, and actually Devon gave a great OVTO webinar on this topic. So if you are interested, we will also share the link to that here. But to explain the principle here, this will be a very short explanation. If you imagine you have curves in the XY space, you can, for each curve, calculate their arc length, just following the curve along. And if you use this and then normalize the curves over their arc length and plot them as X over normalized arc length and Y over normalized arc length, this is what's shown here. This gives you a great option, and that's one thing. You do feature alignment, so you can do some warping and make sure you align relevant features. And then with the aligned signals, you can do statistics and compute means for each point over warped arc length, and standard deviations for each point. And if you then recombine the X over warped arc length and Y over warped arc length back together, you get this XY plot where you can actually have ellipses for each point showing 2D confidence intervals. So in a confidence interval in X and a confidence interval in Y. And here shown in yellow, you have this sort of envelope of all the confidence regions, which is just the outer shape. If you draw each ellipse at each point, you get this sort of corridor-looking thing. As I said, there is a great webinar by Devon on the details of how this works. But I want to sort of touch more on how we use it. And if you look at these ellipses, this is what we use for the scoring here. So this is an example. The plot on the left shows a time displacement diagram or plot, and in this case, it's for a sled test, the gold standard 2 test, where we look at head X displacement. And you will see here I plotted a green ellipse and a red ellipse. Well, what are they based on? The black dashed lines are the pyramid chess responses. The lime green line here in the middle is the characteristic average. So that's calculated using ArcGen. And the darker green lines are the envelope of the 1 standard deviation ellipse, and the red, respectively, lines show the envelope of the 2 standard deviation ellipses. And our scoring works in the following way. So if your blue HBM response, which is, sorry, I forgot to mention this. So here now I have one simulation response in there, which is from an exemplary HBM simulation. If this response in each point here is within the green ellipse for the respective corresponding point of the characteristic average, you get a score of 1. If you are outside of the 2 standard deviations ellipse, you get a score of 0. And for any point in between the 2 ellipses, we do a linear interpolation to get your score. So that's between 1 and 0. And if I now play this animation, you can see that this is evaluated for 500 points across this plot. And in some cases, the ellipses, the blue point will be outside the red ellipse, so you get 0 points. Sometimes it's in the green one, you get 1 point, and sometimes it's just somewhere in between. You can also see that depending on where along the curve you are, the shape of these ellipses is very different. So maybe there is more deviation in terms of displacement. At the beginning, there might be more deviation in terms of time. So that's what you see then in the shape of the ellipse in this plot. For this, you can imagine at this example, the score is quite high. We are inside the green ellipse for quite some time. So the score actually is 0.75. And this is not always as nice, of course, as here. And still, the curves can look pretty similar. But if you imagine that you have one deviation right at the beginning, the arc length is different. And while we want to penalize different looking curves, you carry this error you made at the beginning throughout the rest of the curve. So we added a second score, and this we call the dynamic arc length warping score, so DLW. And this uses the same principle if you're familiar with ISO scoring, that you have a dynamic time warping there. And in simple terms, you just have a sort of window where you don't have the fixed mapping between each point of the arcgen characteristic average and the simulation curve, but you have some margin where the algorithm tries to connect the best dots to get the lowest score. And if I play this animation, you will see that this aims to be within the green ellipse as much as possible. Of course, if the deviation is beyond, in our case, 10% based on arc length, then it will not be able to keep it in the green ellipse. But in this example, the corresponding DLW score is 0.97, so a lot higher and almost sort of a perfect score, which would be 1, of course. So these are the two scores we developed for this. Why did we stick with 2? We found in our testing that this DLW score can be very lenient, so to say, and you still have quite different looking signals that still score relatively high. And by putting 2 scores into the requirements and the technical bulletins, we hope to remedy this effect for the monitoring phase. But this is not something that's set in stone, in the sense that we are really keen to improve this methodology. But this is what's now implemented in the current technical bulletin. So with this, I can give you an overview of how the qualification works. So if you now have a new or a modified HBM and you would like to get a certificate to say that, well, this is now a qualified HBM I want to use in virtual testing, you need to do a full qualification if this has never been, if this is not qualified previously. And that incorporates the geometry, as I mentioned, the quality criteria outputs for the model has to have, and you need to run all the validation load cases. And based on the results of that, there is a check. And essentially, if you fulfill the requirements, this HBM can be used in virtual testing. If the HBM does, for some reason, not fulfill the requirements, it cannot be used. But more often than not, I assume people will use existing human body models that have already been qualified. And here, the user just needs to run 2 simulations. And the reason is that we want to see that the human body model, when used by the specific vehicle manufacturer or supplier, maybe, when they use it, it behaves very similar to what was submitted in the full qualification. And here, the requirement is that you are within 0.1 plus minus points of the score. So this is just making sure you get very similar scores as when the model was originally submitted. And if you pass this check, then the simulation results are eligible for the full points. If it doesn't pass this check, that's still not the end of the world, because you can still use the human body model. Maybe there is some difference we didn't get, but you could still go for a full qualification. If you pass all the thresholds and all the requirements, you can still use it for virtual testing. And all of this, again, is part of CP550, the whole process. So to briefly summarize the part now on qualification, we have these neutral setups. They are available for LS-DYNA and VPS publicly at OpenVT. And they directly have assessment script attached to them, which serve as a plausibility check first, and also then you serve to compare against the physical tests with the scoring. So you actually have the biofidelity scoring in the notebooks. And what's also was done during this qualification is this Euro NCAP technical bulletin. So this procedure was applied for the Euro NCAP CP550. Now, within the last months, Euro NCAP has issued a number of certificates for human body models, and because this came up quite a bit recently, I took the liberty of putting them on screen here. Again, please remember this is just as of today. That can change quite quickly. If people add new models, they will be qualified, and they qualify, then they get also a certificate. So this is just the list as of today. And as you can see, there's a number of commercial models like GHBMC, Hans, HBM Connect, Safer, and also models that are freely available like Thumbs or even open source and hosted on OpenVT like Viva Plus. Note that here, this is the list for Elestina. The VPS users should very soon also get the first HBM available. So this is the qualification submission is almost finished. And another important note, the HBM needs to be used in the unit system is what it was qualified in. So the user cannot transform units as they need, but they need to get the HBM in the unit system that the rest of their model has. So this is important to keep in mind. So several of these models are already qualified in 2 unit systems because most of the OEMs, I think, use either one of 2 unit systems. So that's sort of the challenge of qualification dealt with. Now we talk about harmonized usage and what should we do with the model now so that it's used in a comparable way. Well, in Euro NCAP, we again look back at the process. That's sort of the part here highlighted in red. And again, there's several documents putting their information into that. And essentially, okay, the load case is the one on the very right in terms of pulse, and the driver position is average male HBM. And we have already talked about that. You need to provide this or you will have your maximum scores for virtual testing halved. But what do I really need to set up? And that's in CP551. So you see here that you need to run this load case in 4 different seat positions. And on the right-hand side, you see this sort of simplified seat adjustment range. And the seat positions that were defined now is one position close to where the hybrid 3 dummy would sit. So the seat is in essentially the position for the hybrid 3, and the HBM target position is indicated here. And the second position is what's termed an ergonomic position, and that's based on a regression model from a volunteer study by Reed et al. From 2002, which is a widely used regression model for driver posture and seat position. And there is 2 additional positions. So position 3 and 4 are the same in terms of the approach as is the ergonomic position, but the seat is once moved forward and then backward by the root mean squared error that was provided for the regression model. So just to have the range that's potentially realistic covered by this procedure. There is a spreadsheet where you can calculate your positions. That's also shared on OpenVT, along with some explanations in the spreadsheet. And also note here that then repositioning is only allowed for the extremities to keep the spirit of making sure we introduce it as little differences and uncertainties by user changes. We do not allow changing the spinal posture, for instance. And then in CP551, it also details what it's requested in terms of files and data. So there's some documentation required and some simulation metadata, and then simulation outputs that differs between Elestina and VPS. So for Elestina, you can either submit the raw binary files, the binout files, or generate the CSV file with your binouts using the scripts available on OpenVT in this repository. For VPS users, you can submit your ERF5 files, or you can share selected ERF5 files and or additional CSV files, which there is a script available from Keysight Technology Support. We are in contact with them, and they are working hard to make the process identical for LS-DYNA and VPS, in the sense of there will also be a script running the same Python library, and then this should work more seamless, more streamlined for users regardless of these two codes. For radios users, there is also a description in CP551, and that's just the standard output files from there. So far, we haven't had any requests to change that. And last but not least, animated results are requested just like for the ATD simulations. So to recap, maybe, what do you do when you use a qualified HBM? You have the SLED model you also use for your ATD simulations, and you have a qualified HBM in this case. For that, you just need to demonstrate comparability, and that's detailed in CP550. Then you can combine both your SLED model and the HBM and set up the HBM simulations as detailed in the protocol and CP551. Run these simulations, and then submit results to Euro NCAP. And as we just saw on the last slide, what kind of results you need to submit is explained in CP551. And based on several checks on these results, either it's determined that this is not really a valid HBM result you submitted, or you are eligible for the full virtual testing score since you provided qualified HBM results and eligible results here. Before coming to my conclusions and wrapping up the presentation part of the webinar, I'd like to take some time and acknowledge and thank some people. So first, I'd like to thank everyone who participated in HBM for VT meetings. So there is this framework of experts from industry, academia, regulatory bodies, developers, etc. And they provided really valuable feedback and contributions before and during the development of these public validation setups. And in particular, I'd like to thank the QualiPro HBM for VT sponsors, and they funded the work on the public setups and the methodology. And they were Dynamore, GHBMC, Elements, Humanetics, Autoliv, Volvo, and Toyota Motor Europe. And that brings me to my conclusions. And again, I'll try to stick to the challenges I laid out before. So in terms of qualification, there is a first procedure available. And you can be sure that we will have discussions how we can refine it until 2029. As well as I have covered the harmonized usage. So also here we have a first technical bulletin on the simulations available. And also this will definitely be refined until the next protocol update in 2029. While I have not touched on the two other points specifically, I like to mention them here again. So with respect to harmonized interpretation of results, we deliberately decided to look at this now during the monitoring phase. So to see also the range of results we get, how useful is this, what results can we really use reliably. So this is something we are starting to tackle now, and we are expecting to get a reasonable amount of data by early autumn, late summer, and then can really dive into this evaluation based on monitoring results. But we will do work before that. And with respect to integrity of simulation results, there was a publication on a procedure for traceability in collaboration with IHS in the US. So that's Marcy Edwards et al. From 2025's Kobe conference. And these discussions for implementing this procedure with IHS are ongoing. So I'm currently, constantly having talks with IHS and trying to make sure that we can have a harmonized procedure of how to integrate traceability in or by 2029 for Euro NCAP. And that just gives me maybe the segue into an outlook. The traceability integration I just mentioned, so this is something that will be jointly tackled by Euro NCAP and IHS to make sure this is harmonized also when IHS introduces simulations into their assessment. We are now investigating rib fracture risk assessment as the first candidate for injury assessment for harmonized interpretation of human body model results. There is the plan to include additional HBM anthropometries by 2029, and that specifically is the small female and the average female anthropometry. As I mentioned, we are working on improving the scoring methodology, and for 2029, other assessment or other parts of the assessment are also looking into using human body models. For instance, there is plans of a virtual vulnerable road user VTC implementation. And for that, of course, we also need updates to the qualification procedure to make sure that also these load cases are covered. So this is just a selection of proposed protocol updates. And with that, here are some of the references. As I said before, these will be in the description. And in case you have further questions after we have wrapped up this webinar, the 2026 protocols are available online, of course. And if you have questions to the data upload to the Euro NCAP VTC server, I'm afraid I'm not the ideal person to answer these questions, as this is now a company doing this, and IVEX is in the final weeks of testing, as I hear, so they are inviting the first OEM test candidate now, and I think in the next several weeks they will open it up to all manufacturers and suppliers who previously also had access to this server. So this is finally taking shape. And if you have any questions on the HBM4VT validation catalog or HBM4VT in general, we have compiled some information on the catalog on this general instructions site on OpenVT in the Euro NCAP group on the HBM4VT validation catalog. With that being said, I'm really grateful that so many of you joined this webinar, and I look forward to a good Q&A session. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Felix. That was an excellent overview of both the protocol and everything involved with the new developments. We'll give you maybe a minute of break. We can start with a few questions that have already come in on the chat. Start with a simple one about the use of Jupyter notebooks. The question goes like this: using the Jupyter notebooks for evaluation of the compatibility qualification load cases require deprecated methods from SciPy and Dinosaur, which require a quite old version of Python. This is nowhere specified and needed some workarounds to properly run. Is it planned to update these notebooks to work with a more recent version of Python, including a more recent version of SciPy and Dinosaur?
So this is an excellent question. Thanks for this. We are aware of this issue, and not only aware, we are trying our best to solve it. And the issue is that the library we use, Dinosaur, uses another library called Lasso Dyna. And this Lasso Dyna library, while it is maintained, it's not really that active. And the devil is in the detail that somewhere in there, we need to change 3 lines of code, essentially. We have, for the people who know this kind of Git language, we have done the work, we have forked this, put in a pull request, and now we are really just hoping for them to do this quickly. We have one more idea of how to escalate things, but we really hope this can be done quickly. And in parallel, as I mentioned, for VPS, the Keysight colleagues are developing a library which can read VPS, just in the same way as this Lasso Dyna library can read the LS-DYNA solver results, and that will be published due to license reasons in a new library, and that will just be called Dinosaur Plus. And there is no difference in terms of usability in the end. It's just that when you set up a Jupyter environment or a Python environment rather, you just install Dinosaur Plus instead of Dinosaur, and everything else stays the same. And this is now, as I said, almost done. We are really close to that, and that shouldn't take more than, if you ask me, days, but it's probably weeks knowing how these things go. So thanks for the question. This is something that's also bugging us, because that was the only thing really holding back us using newer Python versions, newer NumPy versions, newer SciPy versions. So I hope this answers that question.
Oh, that's good. Thanks, Felix. Good to know that I can ditch Python 3.9 and go to newer versions. Okay,
and also that's also necessary for the VTC server in the end. So they also are not really happy using old Python versions, of course. So it's a prerequisite we have to get out of the way anyway.
Yeah, that's great. Good to know that. Let's go to some HPM related questions now. And here's a question on initialization of stresses during the start of the simulation. The question goes like this: I've seen considerable differences in the occupant kinematics depending on a proper initialization of the model. In the qualification load cases for the HPMs, the pre-positioning is always part of the simulation, so an initialization for subsequent simulation is not necessary. However, in reality, it will be likely that a stage simulation approach is used for vehicle simulations, where there's no proper initialization, and then the results will be off, naturally. Is an approach to initialize the HPMs going to be part of the regulation of the future? Will it be mandated to do all the pre-simulations and positioning in a single simulation with the actual load case? Or if not, why neither? Whether some current preprocessors like Primer are not working because initial stresses and strains are not exported from materials that don't support that.
Yeah, so the quick answer is probably this is the first implementation. So bear with us to some extent. And while we had a lot of feedback on that from the developers, of course, in terms of this works, this creates issues, whatever. This is exactly a problem with the dynamic relaxation phase, for instance, that some people at an OEM found, and this was not something that was identified with our simulations, but there is nothing stopping people from using a dynamic relaxation phase in their SLED environments in theory. I guess the question is if that still works with all the rest of the of the chain, so to say. I would really encourage people that find these things. If you're from an OEM, get in touch with ACEA if they are covering you. If not, feel free to get in touch with us, and then we can see if it's just something we need to account for in wording, in the technical bulletin, or if it's really where we need to adjust the process. So maybe this is not really very, not the answer you were looking for, because we in the beginning it was impossible to say what kind of things people really use, and this can also be really solver specific. So therefore, I hope you can bear with us and get in touch with your representatives or us to work on these problems.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Felix. Here's another question on positioning the HPMs. Since you mentioned that only positioning of the extremities is allowed and not for the head, pelvis, or other segment angles.
Yeah.
There's a question on if global rotation is allowed.
Yeah, that's allowed. So the thing is, we don't want the geometry to change in the sense that you start changing the spinal position relative to the pelvis or something, but you can change the arm position and the leg position. But if you just rotate the HPM globally, this is fine. And this should be, as far as I heard from the people who did pilots, this is covered and this works okay. Should I try to take the next one directly also?
There's another question, few questions below, if it is allowed to rigidify these parts during the settling, if I get it right. Yeah, for these seats form squashing.
So if it's just for the positioning, that's that's allowed, but this is of course then we need to make sure that we are not running anything rigidified during simulation itself. But I think, so is this the next question? No. Or was
That
this?
was two questions below, since it was
That's why I
on.
missed it. Yeah.
But then we could come to the question that's after also. I think it's also similar about spine, change of spine curvature during settling. So the question goes like this. The seat form might deform the spine due to shape of the seat form, which comes as natural deformation. Does this spine deformation be an issue for the protocol requirements?
For now, it would, yes, because now we have no way of making sure that this doesn't distort the model in a way that's a problem. And so the initial process involves that the model is used in the default spinal curvature. I know what you say, that this is not then what would be happening in a standard human and in ergonomics and stuff. But for frontal, at least if the model has a decent spinal curvature to begin with, they are mostly positioned in a seated posture. So it's not completely wrong in this sense. And these simulation results for the beginning are just monitoring. We are not judging injuries anyway. So for the time being, you cannot deform the spine during settling and during seating in the car.
Here's another question on seating again. So this person is wondering if the hip point of the HPM should be the same as the seat edge point, similar as regulated for the hybrid 3 dummy.
There is a relationship between the seat edge point and the HPM edge point based on the volunteer study by Reed et al. And that's what we use. So it's not the same.
Yeah.
But when you provide your data for the seat edge point, you get the target edge point for the HPM.
Mm-hmm. Good. Thanks, Felix. Now we take a step back, maybe, and have some general questions about the whole process. Here's a question asking, could you tell me what concept or criteria were used to define a good model when creating CP550? Also, now that the first version of CP550 has been completed, has that concept or way of thinking changed in any way?
So the overall concept will be that we said a good model is similar to PMHS data. And that's the very, very broad picture, of course. And then more specifically, we were aware of the fact that whatever criterion we came up initially would not be perfect, because there was quite a short time frame based on the long ramp up to really get the work started. And so we decided to create the initial thresholds for our scoring, which compares the HBM results to the PMHS curves, as I have shown with the 2 slides on the scores. But we selected the threshold in a way that from all the state-of-the-art models that we got the data from, and that were all the models that are essentially stakeholders here, that they qualify. So now the bar is, if you like, really low for the first implementation. And we can only start to work from here, and this is why we really are really keen on improving our scoring, so that we can really say now we set the thresholds based on on biofidelic requirements. And if a model behaves really differently in one of these load cases, then if we are sure it's not the fault of our setup, but if, for instance, just a mind experiment, all other HBMs do really well and one doesn't, and we can trust the setup, then we can say, well, this is not biofidelic in the way that it doesn't conform to PMHS data, and it's not the setup because the other models can do it. So I guess this is where we go from here to 2029. We will not change the CP every couple of months and change the thresholds. We will really get a new set of biofidelity requirements for 2029.
Yeah, excellent. Here's another question about the terminologies used in CP550. What do you mean by harmonization? Will the anthropometric data be harmonized and ortho results? How will you deal with the differences in size, shape, and mass of HPMs and PMHS data?
Yeah, so I'm not sure if I mentioned this today, but there is discussion on if we need to harmonize the average male anthropometry further, because the models can be quite different, which in theory is not a problem. Humans are also different, but when it becomes a problem is when, for instance, lap belt interaction changes considerably, because then one model could be really prone to submarining and others could be unrealistically resistant to submarining. And then if you start using those for assessment, that's really not desirable, because that would bring the OEMs in a position that they just converge on the one model, which gives them the best results in the sense of kinematics in this example. But I also understand that the models that are available didn't fall from the sky. People had there's a lot of data to back up why they look the way they do. And this is why the harmonization part of the anthropometry is something that we are still discussing if we can pull this off within this year to make these, how to put it, to make these requirements on the average male anthropometry more specific. But I get the impression that this is probably something we need to put on a broader forum and make sure that we really have a good process to deal with this. So not the easy answer here, but I guess we are still in discussions how we tackle this.
It's still developing.
It's still developing, yes, you're right.
Yeah. Since you mentioned somewhere in this, someone asking if they could change the pelvis angle.
Yeah, well, not individually. So if you change the whole model globally, then you also change the pelvis angle with respect to the vehicle, of course, but you cannot change the pelvis angle in the sense that you just change the angle of the pelvis.
Yeah. Yeah.
So thumbs, since this question came to me again, so there are several models that are qualified now, some are not. The people who develop these models know if they were qualified because they did a lot of work and sent us the data. So they are not shy about this. They will tell you. And in the example of thumbs V7.1, this is currently not qualified. And as far as I've heard from Toyota, they have no immediate plans of doing the qualification. But I don't know if a lot of people want it, maybe they do it. Or if you want to do it, feel free to run the simulations and submit the data. It's not rocket science, I can tell you this. So, but it's also not no work, as you know, Jobin.
Yeah. Yeah. So we can maybe end with maybe a more general question. Someone wondering where these qualification certificates are available and where they can find it.
So the plan was that the VTC server would be ready now, and it will be ready very soon. And the idea was that there will be a list on there, because that's sort of the place where you should be able to check these things out anyway, because you're only interested in that really if you are someone who's likely to submit results at some point in time. For now, there is no public space where this is broadcast. If you like, we can add that to the general instructions and just have a running list there for the time being. I prefer this to be Euro NCAP's responsibility, but I also don't want to answer too many emails on that, to be honest. So maybe that's a good compromise.
Okay, understandable. That's great. Let's maybe wrap up the webinar for today. Thank you very much, Felix, for taking time to make this excellent talk. And thanks everyone for joining online. And as we wrap this up, I can maybe also mention about the next of the hosted event. That's going to be a Viva Plus roundtable on the 5th of March, where the Viva Plus developers would be talking about the Viva Plus HPM CP550 compatibility load cases. And I'll leave the registration link here on the chat. It'll also be available on the OVTO homepage. But otherwise, thanks again, Felix, and I look forward to seeing more developments in this area.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Thanks for the excellent questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to answer all of them. But as we said, this is a moving dynamic thing, and I'm sure there will be plenty of opportunities to ask these questions. And I have put the slide in on where to go with some of these questions, and I guess many of the names I recognize, so you will know where to find me.
Yep, for sure. Thanks,
Thanks,
Felix.
everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.